for those who don't know me, I'm Elaine, and I'd really like to thank you for coming along tonight and giving your time for this first, but hopefully not last attempt at a Litterinar or a webinar about litter. So as said, check that you're on mute, and as I'm going through things, could you please pop any questions or comments in the chat, and then Emma will feed them to me at the end. As I mentioned in my initial email, this is being recorded, but if it does end up being used in any way, I'll only use my part of it, so you don't need to worry about appearing on something. And I think it's more likely, though, that I'll either do a separate recording later, or I'll end up running this this introductory session multiple times. So I'm joined tonight by Beverly Walker and John Paget from Off the Ground, and Emma Boatman from Boatman Admin Services is helping us run the meeting tonight to make sure that everything goes smoothly. And so the reason that I am going well outside my comfort zone as a writer is that I thought it would be a good idea to bring together those who have an interest in stopping litter, because I think people are very keen that we do not return to pre-pandemic levels of rubbish strewn all across our communities. And so as part of this, I think it's important to make sure that everyone is on more or less the same page. And I know that there's a mix of experience levels here, from those who are just starting to dip their toe into the water of waste management or litter. And so there are also those who have been doing this for probably much longer than me and who may be coming at things from a different angle. I do hate to start off on a negative, and I know I've sent these to you already, but I do want to be as clear as possible about what tonight is not. So I would like us to avoid talking shop. So we all know that litter is a problem, and I am going to assume that everyone already picks up litter when they can, or they run their own community cleanups. We will not be looking at cleaning because we're either already doing it, or maybe it's something that only the local authority can take care of. So it's outside of our control. I also want to try to avoid complaining and the blame game of who should be doing what but isn't. I have to admit, I can rant with the best of them, and those who know me are aware that I've gained a fair amount of cynicism over the past 6 years, so please call me up on it if I go too far down the complaint rabbit hole. This will also not be looking at fundraising or how to get money to carry things out, at least not yet. And there are a few reasons for this that I just want to briefly run through. So first, every funder has a different agenda, and this can lead to a very common problem, which is being seen to be doing something, but not actually taking the actions that will lead to genuine impact, or potentially even taking actions that are detrimental. Now, I've just mentioned that I'm good at ranting, and I am going to rant briefly about this, so you can see an example of what I mean. So there was a county campaign a few years ago that gave out anti-litter stickers to children and leaflets to adults. So the campaign can point to the number of stickers and leaflets distributed, but the problem with this is that both ended up as litter. And campaigns like this also tend to use what I consider to be the wrong metrics. They may look at how much PR they got, so how many articles were in the local newspaper, for example. Now, I don't know if I've seen any locally run campaigns that actually measure whether litter is reduced year on year. I do think we need to be asking questions of how interventions will reduce litter or change behavior in the desired way, and this is something that I'll talk about a little later tonight. I also believe thinking about how much something costs, it ends up limiting ideas. And as I'll explain in a bit, it's buy-in from businesses and government that tends to be the most valuable. And what I mean by buy-in this case is the willingness to do things 100%, not a half-hearted attempt and then pointing to it as not working. This also isn't Chippenham or Wiltshire specific. We have people from across the country here tonight, and I hope that we can get more people at future events. For those of you who are from Chippenham, I would be very happy to have a chat with you about what we can do locally after the election in May. And finally, although I think I'll be the one doing much of the talking tonight, this is not about off-the-ground project managing anything, because quite simply, we do not have the capacity. For those of you who run your own anti-litter groups, or if you're involved in any type of community organization, you're probably already familiar with this next diagram, even if you've never seen it before. So community groups tend to operate on a pyramid-based structure, with a greater number of people being at the bottom, which is contributing a little bit of time and energy to whatever the cause happens to be. For anti-litter groups, this bottom bit, it tends to be those who are happy to participate in a litter pick, but potentially they're unable to help further. As you climb the pyramid, more time and effort is expended, but there are fewer and fewer people willing to take on any additional work, whether that's the administration, communication through PR and social media, or running projects. And so I would love to see if we can figure out how to flatten the pyramid so that it's not the same few people trying to do everything, but others are willing to get involved where they can. So if that's not what we're doing, why is everyone here tonight? Well, I'm going to start by providing a general overview of the litter landscape and looking at what we as individuals and community groups can do to make sure we're not reinventing the wheel. I'll explore a little bit about how we can get the available tools into the hands of the right people, or potentially do things ourselves within the community. Part of this will be sharing some ideas for how we build on our existing work so that those who are already running things can amplify the message. And my intent is to highlight what we can potentially do that's not already being done. And finally, I would like us to consider how we want to move forward, or not, as the case may be, if there's no interest in this. I've already mentioned I can be quite cynical, and I'm not going to hold my breath waiting for the government to institute a deposit return scheme or to run a national anti-litter campaign. So instead, can we find a middle ground between the focus on litter picks, which I think is pretty much sorted and addressed by Keep Britain Tidy, and lobbying the government, which is also important, but the outcomes of that are completely beyond our control. So are there other actions that we can take with our limited time and energy as volunteers that may bring about the changes we want to see? So as part of this, do we want to maybe form a wider network to share what we've done, what works, what doesn't work, and share the tools as we find them? The problem of litter is not going to be solved with one 6-week campaign, and we are not going to get to the bottom of things tonight. But this is something I'd appreciate your thoughts on a bit later tonight, or as I mentioned earlier, or if you've just popped in, please leave questions and comments in the chat, and Emma will feed those into me at the end. And you can always get in touch with me afterwards by email. Now, some of you already know me, but for those who don't, my background is as an archaeologist, and I like to joke that's how I got interested in litter, because after all, what are artifacts but ancient rubbish? But it was on top of this that I worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bristol, investigating how behavior change can work for environmental purposes. So this academic background means that I'm a big believer in using existing research and relying on data and statistics to understand whether we're actually having an impact and achieving our goal of reducing litter. So all of this fed into the creation of Rubbish Walks, which Beverly, John, and I formed 6 years ago to help clean up Chippenham. But we soon rebranded to Off the Ground because we wanted to expand our focus to 3 different strands of activity. Cleaning would be one aspect because running community cleanups are a good way to help people become more aware of the problem that rubbish causes. And it's also a good first step for people to take just in terms of getting involved with a community anti-litter group. So the hope was that volunteers would enter the base of the pyramid and work their way to different levels. So that first year we ran, it was almost monthly litter picks, and we soon settled into doing a large community cleanup about every other month. And that continued throughout 2019. But we obviously hit pause last year due to the pandemic, but we have been encouraging people to borrow equipment so that they can get out and clean on their own. So education is the second strand. And although we've done a little bit here and there, we really struggled with this one because we were either told we could speak at an assembly, which we just don't think is the right solution, or we didn't have the right connections to actually talk to anyone from the local schools. Now, projects is the third strand, and we did try quite a lot of different things with varying degrees of success. In 2017, we ran the Love Chippenham campaign that, as it was originally envisioned, would have seen bespoke posters in every shop, banners on the town bridges, a residential bin scheme to extend the urban bin infrastructure, which basically means that for people who are storing their bins next to the pavement, they would have a label on it saying that those passing by could use that bin for their litter. We wanted to try chalk trails in the local parks, just to remind people about the costs and dangers of littering. And we encourage people to adopt a street or adopt an area to keep clean. Now, for various reasons, it did not quite go according to plan, and this is why buy-in is so valuable. When businesses and local government want you to succeed and can help you around obstacles, it makes it much easier to get things done. Otherwise, it can be difficult to deliver things that are not within your direct control. We've also lobbied for more bins, the use of different colored bin bags where possible to make bins more visible, and ask that litter be collected before mowing to stop one piece of rubbish being shredded into 1,000. As you may have guessed, not all of these suggestions were taken up. We've experimented with the nudge green footsteps approach to make bin use the explicit social norm. We've hand delivered a list of potential solutions directly to our MP, and we've chatted with counselors about the problem. We even carried out focus groups with teens and young adults in a local park, which was eye-opening for a variety of reasons. I don't know if I'd recommend this unless you have very thick skin. But for those of you who are from Chippenham, you might be thinking that you never saw any of this. And this is a big part of the problem. Going back to that pyramid diagram, when it's only a few people who are operating at those middle and upper levels in their spare time, it can be difficult to scale up and give activities the attention they need. So, however, when people are willing to provide greater commitment and participation, amazing things can happen. One of our most successful projects is Refill Chippenham, and that's because Rob Gillies, who unfortunately couldn't make it tonight, but he was the right person to run this, and he was able to project manage it from beginning to end. Rob, he previously worked for the environmental consultancy Eunomia, and he had contacts at City to Sea to get Chippenham signed up as part of the National Refill Scheme. And perhaps most importantly, he was willing to do all of the necessary legwork to get the cafes, pubs, and restaurants signed up to the program, and then do all the marketing and PR to help bring attention to it. So this is what we've been doing, and I suspect that every community group who has been running for more than a few years, will have similar stories of activities, some of which worked, some of which didn't. This also does not take into account what the larger national organizations are doing. So people like Keep Britain Tidy, Hubbub, Surfers Against Sewage, City to Sea, Clean Up Britain. So anti-litter and plastic reduction activities are taking place at a lot of different levels across the UK, which brings us really to the present day. Although we obviously stopped the community cleanups last year, I ended up talking to a lot of people from across the UK instead, and this revealed several things to me. First, everyone tends to be operating in their own space or silo. There seems to be very little attempt to join things together. And related to this is that most of us seem to be using social media to broadcast our activities, but there is not necessarily any focus on targeting things, either to those who are more likely to litter in the first place, or getting things into the hands of those who have the power to accomplish more than we can as individuals and groups. And in part, I suspect that this comes down to that lack of person power to get things done. So I also learned that there were a lot of tools out there, and I have to thank Ray Jones from the North Devon Wardens for introducing me to a few things from the enforcement side of things. And I'm not quite sure if Andrew's here. If Andrew is here, you'll have a chance to hear from Andrew of LitterCam AI a bit later. So the tools are there, but they're not necessarily getting into the right hands. Now, I had Rob's example in mind, and I also ended up doing a lot of Zoom networking for my business last year. And networking is a really interesting experience because if and when you find the right person, you're no longer pushing against a locked door. Suddenly it's thrown open and things get a lot easier. So I've turned this idea into the Putting Litter First series, and it's what we'll be looking at in just a moment. But first, I do have a confession. I would love to put all of us volunteer litter pickers out of business. I would love to see a litter-free UK where it's possible to go for a walk or visit a local park and there not be any litter to collect, where the money that's currently spent by local authorities on cleaning could go towards schools or the NHS, where the time that volunteers spend picking up rubbish could go towards general beautification projects like community gardens or increasing biodiversity. But for this to happen, we need to ask how what we're doing is going to lead to our desired outcome, and to stop seeing litter picking as the only option and the only thing within our control. So there are things that I think we can do that could potentially allow us to have a wider influence. Now, the first is simply being aware that there is no magic bullet or quick fix when it comes to stopping litter. Over on the Off the Ground blog earlier, I introduced this Swiss cheese model that virologist Ian Mackey adapted to show how different layers were needed to control the spread of coronavirus. So in the same way, we have to recognize that we're going to have a better chance of success in tackling litter if we use multiple tools and solutions. The second part of this is being aware of the false consensus bias. In plain English, that's the idea that most other people will think and behave in a similar way to us, which it makes perfect sense as a shortcut for the brain, because most of the people that we regularly spend time with, our friends, our family, they do think and behave in a similar way. The problem with approaching things in this way is that those who are more likely to litter are not necessarily like us. They will not have the same concerns and motivations. So using imagery or messaging that appeals to us is unlikely to be effective. An example of this in action is the Don't Mess with Texas campaign. Over 5 years, it successfully reduced roadside litter by 72% by focusing on the demographics most likely to litter, which in this case were young men aged 18 to 35. This group had a distrust or a dislike of authority, so traditional signage was ignored because it was seen as being from the hated authority figure. Or maybe it used imagery that just didn't resonate. So if you are into muscle cars, a picture of a fluffy kitten probably is not going to get your attention. So instead, what the Don't Mess with Texas campaign did was use advertisements with athletes, musicians, and other celebrities who were known to this age group and highlighted that people like them, so these were people who were proud Texans, that they didn't litter. And I think tapping into this group mentality and using in-group policing is going to be necessary in the battle against litter. And likewise, we also need constant and consistent messaging that littering is unacceptable and that there is no such thing as good litter. So in part, it's really necessary that we address a commonly held belief that litter isn't a problem because it makes a job for someone. And on top of that, there's also a CPRE survey that says that 15% of people believe that it's okay to litter if an area is already littered. And I find this number staggering, but it's 37% of those who responded reported that it was sometimes or always okay to leave rubbish behind if there were no bins. Also, 42% of smokers surveyed thought it was acceptable to drop litter, which is why cigarette butts are the #1 littered item in the world. It's something like 1 trillion are dropped around the globe every year. So this idea that littering is okay in certain circumstances or in certain contexts is very common. And it's one of the problems with regular litter picking. According to Zero Waste Scotland, there was a study done that showed that there's a bit of a paradox at play, where so clean areas tend to stay clean longer, but areas that are known to be cleaned on a regular basis are more likely to be littered. Dealing with the behavioral side of littering is an uphill battle. And this is why getting to the point where there's a cultural autopilot, so litter automatically gets taken home or put into a bin, it requires short, medium, and long-term approaches. And this is not something that's going to be solved with a one-off campaign. And this is why I think it's necessary to find a middle ground between litter picks, which again, they're already being done. They have been done for a number of years. And the lobbying of government for changes to laws and systems, it's already being done. We can contribute to consultations and we can sign petitions and the like. It's all very important, but it's really difficult to say what, if anything, will actually come from that. So if you have been following along in the blog, the Putting Litter First series launched earlier this month, and it's based on encouraging people to consider who they know and who they can talk to. So I'm going to give some examples of how I see this potentially working. If you can ignore the pandemic for a moment, a good starting place is cinemas, theaters, sports stadiums, buses, and trains. And this is because these are all areas where people tend to leave behind their rubbish at the seat, and there's the expectation that somebody will clean up after them. So by starting here, it's a way to begin to change this behavior and attitude. So imagine for a moment at a football game, it could be at a small local pitch like we have here in Chippenham, or it could be something all the way up to the Premier League. So at halftime or at the end of the game, volunteers with bags in the team's colors are positioned where they can be given rubbish. There are announcements during the game about making sure rubbish is brought to the bins or the volunteers and not left behind. Now, this would need to be done long-term. It's not something that could be done for one game or one season, but multiple years would be needed. There would need to be 100% commitment behind this. But I think this type of approach would be one step towards breaking people of the current habit of leaving rubbish at their seat and changing the mindset that it's okay to leave rubbish behind. So imagine if all sports teams were to get behind something like this. And I think it's the closest thing we have in the UK to the don't mess with Texas angle. Cinemas and theaters could do something similar. And that brings me to buses and trains, as they are other locations where people tend to leave things on the assumption that it's someone's job to clean it up. So several years ago, Beverly tried contacting First Grade Western to ask about whether they could simply add a little extra to their usual announcements. So something like, please make sure you have your belongings and take all rubbish with you to dispose of at the exits. It's a very simple way to make a social norm explicit, that what the proper behavior is clear. The response, though, was a generic negative. However, if we have existing relationships with people in various industries, we may have better luck in getting ideas heard, or at the very least, getting an answer as to why certain things won't work. It may be because it's never been tried before and there is fear around change. Equally, there could be a genuine reason that those of us on the outside are unaware of. This will then allow us to go back to the drawing board and find solutions that are more appropriate. Education is always cited as one of the key things that's needed to combat litter, and I wanted to share a little bit about this. So I had a chat last year with a local official who will remain nameless. They originally told me that they had decades of experience in dealing with local issues, including litter. Later, though, they told me that anti-litter education wasn't possible because the council could not afford to send people into schools. And this was the final bit of evidence that I needed to prove to myself that anti-litter tools were not getting into the right hands, and that there is a tendency to reinvent the wheel. So I would like to introduce the Eco Schools program. It's the largest environmental education program in the world, with 19 million students enrolled across 68 countries. So students are responsible for setting the agenda for the school. And the program's designed to link up to the curriculum in whatever country it's in. And in England, it's overseen by Keep Britain Tidy. And so as part of this program, schools do activities that advance them through bronze, silver, and green flag stage. And as far as I know, there is no cost until a school goes for the green flag. And so that cost is about, I think it's 200 to 250 pounds right now. So right now, it's not clear to me how many schools in Chippenham or Wiltshire are active in the program. I know Abbeyfield just was awarded their green flag, so many congratulations to them. But last year, I spoke with the National Eco Schools Coordinator and found out that many had registered in the past, but were inactive in the system. And to me, this potentially seems like low-hanging fruit for any local authority. Can they get every school to achieve green flag status and remain active? Now, as an Eco Schools assessor, I admit that I may be a little biased because I've seen the incredible work schools have done. This is where talking to people will be beneficial. Are teachers and parents aware of the program? And if so, are there reasons that schools have chosen not to participate? I do not want to add any more burdens on teachers who are already dealing with a lot at the moment, but this is potentially where parents can provide support. When it comes to litter or any environmental message, constant and consistent messaging is needed across all years, from nursery all the way up to sixth form in college. I don't have children, but even I know that you can't tell them something once and expect it to stick. Eco Schools is an opportunity to share an anti-litter and a pro-environmental message on a long-term basis. Now, enforcement is another key issue that people talk about when it comes to litter. And again, I have Ray Jones to thank for introducing me to a few aspects of how litter enforcement powers could be extended, such as through the Community Safety Accreditation Scheme and Voluntary Code of Conduct for food on the go. So these types of things, it takes things out of our hands as individuals, but I will be writing about this later as part of the Putting Litter First series, because there are ways planning and licensing can potentially be used. So I actually just want to check with Emma whether Andrew is here. Andrew Kemp, I'm afraid I can't see.
No, he's not here.
Okay, no, that's fine. So LitterCam AI is a new bit of technology. You might have seen it recently on the BBC, and it uses computer vision technology to work with digital CCTV cameras, and it allows councils to easily record littering activities from vehicles, and it will send the relevant details to police. So these are just a few of the potential slices we can start to layer in the battle against litter. But regardless of what's done, I briefly want to return to the idea of data collection and sharing. My Twitter feed is full of fun posters and intriguing anti-litter ideas from across the UK. I've shared some of my own ideas with you tonight. But hand on heart, I do not know which ones are going to be the most effective or at all effective in achieving the goal of reducing the amount of litter in communities. What is genuinely having a positive impact? It seems to me that there's a need for the anti-litter community to develop a methodology to assess what we do and get the results of those assessments out to others to learn from. So that our time and energy as volunteers can go towards what is more likely to achieve the goal of litter reduction, I think there really is a need for us to link up to share our experiences, provide case studies to learn from, and potentially mentor each other so that we're no longer reinventing the wheel, but developing the most efficient wheel possible. So I know Mark's here, and this is something that Mark and I have discussed in terms of potentially forming a network, because this is something that we think would allow all of this to occur. But I have just presented a lot of information, and I'd like to give you the chance to think about it while I answer some of the questions that have come through. So as I've mentioned before, we are not going to solve this tonight, but it would just be useful to see if people were interested in taking further steps, or if it is a bit too overwhelming right now, and perhaps this should be put on the back burner. So I am going to stop sharing.